Hey guys, Ex-Peon here, and today we are asking the question of how many classes does D&D actually need? Now, there could potentially be 100 classes, or there could potentially be about three. So let's talk about three. So, the 1974 release of Dungeons and Dragons, it only had three classes technically, though it is worth noting that races were distinct from classes, though not super distinct. And dwarves and halflings were basically just better fighters with lower level limits. So greater initially, but in the long run worse. But elves, it's kind of a complicated question or topic because elves are sort of this, depending on how you read the text, which is super confusing, elves are either this sort of like fighter magic user hybrid, which would basically be a distinct fourth class, or elves are basically just like guys who one day they're a fighter and one day they're a magic user. So, and there's also anti-clerics, which is something I talked about in a previous video. So there's really more than three classes, but it's it's easiest to and most simple just to say there's three classes. So these three classes, they're fighting men, magic users, and clerics. And this is quite different from modern D&D. Modern D&D, I believe, has 13 classes, and these classes are all quite similar just with a few mechanical and thematic differences. Like a fighter and a barbarian, they're both big guys who hit people with stuff, but there's some thematic differences. Barbarians have more of a nature theme, fighters have more of an implied civilizational theme, and mechanically, barbarians they rage, fighters they do their thing, but not really that different at the end of the day. And that's kind of how it is for a lot of classes with like sorcerers and wizards. They have their thematic differences, but at the end of the day, they're still pretty similar. So going from 13 classes to three, in large part, is kind of just combining these classes. Like a magic user covers, the thief, or sorry, not the thief. The magic user covers the wizard, the sorcerer, the artificer, probably the warlock. Maybe that one's a little bit more ambiguous. And the fighting man covers the fighter, the ranger, the barbarian, the paladin, maybe the monk, though not perfectly, because fighting men are all about wearing armor and using weapons, and that's not really what monks do. So, and that is worth noting that in simplifying, you do kind of lose the ability to super distinctly replicate some of those fantasies, such as the fantasy of a monk. That's kind of harder to do with just a fighting man. And then, of course, the cleric. You have like in 5e, you would have like the paladin, the cleric, the druid probably, and the paladin. Whereas 50 years prior, you just have the cleric. But so there's definitely in reducing classes, you definitely do lose very you do lose distinct fantasy archetypes. Though it's not necessarily because a fighter who accepts a quest from, say, a lady in the lake and receives a magic sword, that fighter's a paladin, even if he's literally just a fighter or fighting man. I mean, he has a holy sword that gives him some powers and a quest, so he's basically a paladin. And I think you could use expanded spell lists to cover most spellcaster fantasies, like a magic user who uses pretty standard arcane spells like fireball. That's a that's just a wizard, but or a sorcerer. But if they get a unique spell list, or if they just use more nature themed spells like web or whatever, then you could say that's a druid. You don't really need to have all these distinct classes, or at least, yeah, I don't think it's really necessary. It can be nice, it can be fun. So I would definitely say that you do, in many ways, lose certain role playing possibilities if you greatly reduce the classes, but not necessarily. Because this is also, if you have the three core classes fighting man, magic user, cleric, you don't have a skill system. So it isn't, so, maybe your fighting man could basically be a tracker. You'd have to work something out with your DM, maybe not. But in that way, you kind of open up more possibilities. Well, maybe that fighting man is a tracker, or maybe they're really into heraldry and noble court stuff. Maybe that magic user takes a tinkering element side of things. Clerics are more narrow. The other two classes are much more general. Clerics are still very specifically holy warrior with Christian iconography who only uses blunt weapons, specifically turns the undead through faith, and prepares spells, which I'm not a super huge fan of the OG cleric, but so it's much more specific, whereas the other two are general. But with having those two classes be general, you can cover, I think, most fantasy archetypes, especially if you work with your DM a bit. So that's something to consider for having a much greater reduced number of classes. You do kind of lose a lot of options in regards to character expression, but not maybe not as much as you might expect, especially if you have a DM who's willing to work with you. But a second thing to consider is niche protection, which that's something I don't like about 5e. Honestly, is just niche protection is out the window. Like, you have like, of course, a fighter. They use their weapons. They're supposed to be the special guys in combat, and also they're supposed to like be able to last long and really stick in the fight. But then these other classes, including the spellcasters, they get all these tools, and also just combined with the way the game tends to play out and the limited number of encounters that actually happen, it often ends up being the case that the other classes are about as durable as the fighter and can do about as much consistent damage while having all these unique abilities and just other things where, a wizard has all these spells that can do what other characters do, and a druid can turn into a bear and fight as well as a barbarian. And I mean, I'm not going to get into it. I don't really focus that much on 5e these days. I guess maybe I don't have as strong as opinions or as much to say it as I used to, but it's definitely obvious that 5e has much less niche protection than old school D&D, because when you just have three classes, the there's much more niche protection, because the cleric is the only one who can cast healing spells, and they're the absolute best at dealing with things like undead. Like the other classes just aren't really in the same realm, and the fighting man and the cleric both have the best armor, so the magic user is just totally edged out in terms of armor and durability. And the fighting man has this real niche when it comes to ranged combat and using bows. So there's these niches, this niche protection, and I think it makes it so each class is valuable in its own way. And there's actually some interesting synergies with this. So, for example, dealing with undead, clerics, they turn undead. They're super good at it, but they actually can't use edged weapons, which means, at least if you're going by default, they can't actually use silver weapons. And some undead monsters, like wights and wraiths, they are specifically weak to silver or can't even be touched by a non-magic, non-silver weapon. So it's a situation where the cleric, they can, cause these creatures to flee, but unless they're much higher level, they can't actually destroy the undead monster. But the fighter, he can use edged weapons, so he can use that silver arrow, he can use that silver dagger, and he can actually damage these. And because he can use magic swords, he's also just much more likely to get a magic weapon. So it's kind of an interesting balancing act where they have their niches, but they also have these interesting synergies where the cleric causes the undead to flee, the fighter actually has the ability to damage and kill the undead, and of course the magic user has their own unique things. They have their spells, so there's a long list of things they can do. So I think that really illustrates how having just three classes, can seem restrictive or maybe a little punishing, and but there can be surprising depth to it, and I don't think you tend to get that kind of depth if you have just the smattering of classes that aren't super distinct from each other. So one last thing to consider is you might have noticed there's no thief, because the thief came in the 1975 Greyhawk supplement. It did not come in the original release. So that's one fantasy that I guess you might say is a bit debated or up to opinion, whether you need a thief and whether you need a thief class to kind of play out that fantasy. Some people have the attitude of, if you want to be a thief, just steal stuff. And other people have the attitude that you need specific mechanics and abilities for that to really play that out. I would probably lean more towards the latter, but that is kind of a situation where, depending on DM opinion, you might be able to actually play out a thief fantasy without needing a thief class. You could have a fighter who only wears leather armor or doesn't wear armor at all, and kind of work with their DM to specifically be a kind of a light guy who doesn't create a lot of noise. Maybe he, uses stealthy weapons like bows and like hand crossbows and does all these things. And I guess one thing to consider is magic items, because maybe you don't even really need a thief class if you get the right magic items like elven cloaks, which make you invisible, and I want to say elven boots, which make you inaudible. So it could also be the case that having like core three classes, even if you can't really initially play out certain fantasies as well, just by getting magic items, you can actually get much more latitude to cover some of those fantasies. So that's just something to consider. And I think the most interesting thing to consider really is the world building implications and just sort of how you interact with the world. Because if you have, because reading through the OD&D booklets, it's interesting to note how the three classes aren't just classes, but like they're also like sort of like social classes. Like the fighting class becomes like the martial nobility, the barons, etc., the knights. The magic users, you might say they're sort of like the scholars, but with magic, and they're a distinct class, and they have their towers eventually, and they do their thing. And then the clerics are the clergy, and it's this interesting thing where you you get three classes that aren't just mechanical classes or fantasy archetype classes, but they're social classes. And I think there's something really interesting to that, because obviously thieves exist, but are thieves really a comparable social class to clergy and scholars and martial nobility? I would say not, unless it was a setting with a ton of thieves and organized crime. So I think that's a really interesting thing to consider, that last part, like, because especially if you're playing with like domain emphasis and whatnot, a high level fighter has a very distinct role, whereas a high level thief is probably at the highest levels. Maybe they just become like a guild master of thieves, make a thieves guild, but that's a very specific thing. Whereas a baron, a a wizard with students under them, a high priest with acolytes and whatnot under them. I don't know those. I think those have a much more obvious and important and central role in this fantasy medieval society. Whereas I think other classes like thieves and assassins are maybe a little bit more fluff. But so that's something to consider. I guess you might say that having more classes shifts the focus of the game. If you just have the three classes, then you maybe don't have as much of a focus on, I guess, like the individual crime aspects, because you're not really equipped to do a ton of legit sneaking and whatnot. So maybe you retain more of a focus on like war and battle and recruiting followers, and perhaps having access to things or classes like thieves, perhaps that might shift the focus and might even shift the late game focus to be away from being a baron and leading armies. But that's just speculation. And of course, it did not take long at all for people to make classes for D&D and to make custom classes, and for the designers to add new classes. There's definitely a human psychology thing where it's just fun to add more options, and new classes are interesting. So I don't know how many people actually play with just three or four classes, or at least how many people stuck with that, because it's just fun to add classes. So maybe there is wisdom to kind of the approach that old school D&D seemed to take, which is where you have like core classes like fighters, magic users, thieves, and clerics. And then other classes require like especially high ability scores to even access. And maybe there's wisdom in that, where you're not just like the super diverse circus party of assassins and acrobats and barbarians and super, I guess, unique people, but you're mostly kind of the core fantasy archetypes, but sometimes you'll have a monk in there or an assassin in there. So I don't know, maybe there's wisdom in that. But these are just things to consider. Thank you for watching. I hope that gave you a new perspective on things, made you think some interesting thoughts about game design. It certainly had that effect for me. So thank you for watching, and as always, XP on. Bye.